This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
I think the challenge we have is that if you go back and read de Tocqueville is what I would call America 1.0. That's the America in which everything was local, people lived in towns. Then you have industrialization, you have mass immigration, you have urbanization, and then there's an attempt to rebuild the social fabric, which is what you have in the late 19th century with all these trans-local organizations. That is America 2.0. Post-1960s, lots of change in where people live, how organizations are organized, and now you have this great dissatisfaction in large parts of America. We need to create a civil society or a set of social institutions that responds to America 3.0, and that is not going to happen in Washington. It's not going to happen top-down vertical. It's going to happen place by place, and ideally there's going to be lots of these networks. They're going to be helping people do more across the country. We need America 3.0 civil society.
The Village Square, a nervy bunch of liberals and conservatives who believe that disagreement and dialogue make for a good conversation, a good country, and a good time. At the Village Square, we talk about politics, religion, and race. You know, the topics your mom taught you never to discuss in polite company. Listen, at the Village Square, we make pigs fly.
Welcome to Village Squarecast. This is Corey Nathan. I am so glad to be with you again. Thank you for joining us for Fragile Neighborhoods, Repairing American Society, one zip code at a time. Funding for this program was provided through a grant from Florida Humanities with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Check out Florida Humanities online at floridahumanities.org. This program is part of a running theme that Village Square is focusing on this year, Join or Die. And that's certainly not a laughing matter, but it is kind of a shocking title, but it does underscore the imperative of what we have facing us in this country and in our neighborhoods. It's about how we connect with our neighbors and others in our communities, even as we're in this moment of extreme polarization. So this conversation focuses on how to do that in our own neighborhoods. Many of us live in areas that have serious problems. I mean, you could turn on the news or doom scroll Facebook, or have you discovered the Nextdoor app? I've discovered the Nextdoor app. I was just looking for a local plumber, and apparently I missed the news that there's like a zombie apocalypse and they've already taken over the local Piggly Wiggly. But seriously, we're joined on this program. Dr. Seth Kaplan is our guest on this program. And Dr. Kaplan is a leading expert on fragile states, political transitions, conflict prevention, state building, governance, and human rights. He is a professional lecturer at Johns Hopkins University and visiting fellow at George Mason University's Mercatus Center's program on pluralism and civil exchange. He has 20 years on-the-ground experience managing projects in developing countries, and he has worked for several large multinationals. And Dr. Kaplan is the author of 4 books, including his most recent and the topic of today's conversation, Fragile Neighborhoods, Repairing American Society, one zip code at a time. He's published widely in publications such as the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and Journal of Democracy. He lives in the Kemp Mill part of Silver Spring, Maryland, with his wife and 3 kids. And this is the best part. This is why I am definitely listening very, very closely. He is a long-suffering Mets fan. I am too, so that's why I'm a little biased. This program is facilitated by Village Square's founder and president, Liz Joyner, and past Village Square board chair, Bill Maddox. We are grateful for the support of James Madison Institute to make this program possible. So let's turn it over to my dear friend, Liz Joyner, who dives right in with the first question.
All right, Seth, I'll go ahead and open with the first question. Seth, how did you arrive at the concept of fragile neighborhoods, and what is a fragile neighborhood anyway?
Well, thank you, Liz, and thank you, Bill. I think the best way to describe what a fragile neighborhood and how I got to that concept is to talk about my journey, my background. I, for most of my professional career, I have worked on fragile states. That means Africa, that means the Middle East, that could be Latin America, 8 parts of Asia, countries that are chronically unstable. I wrote the first book on fragile states. It's a concept people use the way I use fragility, fragile states, fragile societies, fragile neighborhoods. It's basically a place in which there's not a lot of social cohesion, there's not a lot of trust. There aren't the institutions that bring people together, that help people thrive. Any place, neighborhood, community, society, state, they all need good institutions that enable flourishing. And we could talk about what that means. But so when I say a fragile neighborhood, I, for the most part, mean a place with not great relationships, not a lot of trust, not a lot of institutions bringing people together and helping them solve problems together, helping them know each other, helping create a system of social ties that will support them, especially when they need it. You often don't have them when you need them. If you have them when you don't need them, they're even going to be more important when you need them.
So I want to follow up on that and ask a question that I always ask book clubs whenever the first week, whenever we gather. And as you probably know, prior to your coming to Tallahassee to do a presentation for our Village Square group, we had a book club that met for 3 sessions to read your book and to discuss it. First time we got together, first question I asked, because we're the Village Square and we break all sorts of taboos, we talk about things that you're not supposed to talk about in polite company, like politics, religion, race. We also break the taboo of judging a book by its cover. And so one of the things that I ask people to do is to say, judge this book by its cover. And the question that I had for them that I'd like for you to answer is this: does the neighborhood that is presented on the cover look like what you would have imagined a fragile neighborhood to look like when you heard the title?
Well, first of all, I don't pretend to say that I'm an expert on book covers. The publisher is an expert on book covers. Exactly. And it so happens that there's a series of books, mine is not the only one, that talks about something about alienation, fragility, loneliness, and they often use this image of a bunch of houses or a basketball court or whatever, something, a town in which there's no people in it. And I think the idea is, so it's fragile because there's no relationships. There's material well-being without relationships. Now, when I think of fragility, I think there's different types of like fragile neighborhoods. I think the type of fragile neighborhood that people would most likely think about, which I think you're alluding to, Bill, they're thinking of a poor neighborhood in which they don't have such nice houses. They don't have they are materially lacking, therefore they're fragile. But one of the main goals of my book and everything I work on, even in fragile states, is for us to get away from this idea that there's a material, technical way of addressing our problems. I think, of course, the right policy matters. I think having a house, if you don't have a house, matters. Having food matters. So I don't want to say none of that matters. I think it all matters. But I think ultimately the success of any place is the nature of its relationships. The health of a country depends on the health of its relationships. So when I talk about fragility, I don't just mean those poor places, those that will be more obviously fragile to you, partly because I know some poor places that aren't fragile. They may lack material wealth, but they have such social connectiveness, social support. I actually don't think those places will be poor in the future because they are so connected with each other. They're helping each other. They're going to thrive. It's just a matter of time. As opposed to when I think about social poverty and fragility, I'm often thinking of materially well-off places where you don't know your neighbors. You have no reason to talk to anybody. There's no local institutions. It's a vacuum. It's what you might call a desert. We talk about food deserts. I want to introduce this idea that there's institutional deserts. There's no institutions. There's not only material poverty, there's social poverty. And that's why that cover, I think, alludes to this broader idea that economic and social poverty and fragility are somewhat, we're talking about many permutations and many places. And yes, you could be poor and fragile, but you also could be materially well off and fragile as well.
Well, let me just say that I think your publishers, I don't know whether it led to more book sales or how it affected sales, but I think your publishers served you very well, because this was a really provocative discussion that I'm not sure, among mostly middle-class people, who I'm not sure would have imagined coming into the conversation that you were talking about them, and yet they quickly understood that, wait a minute, you're not describing the problem strictly in materialistic forms. And I think that was really helpful. So anyway, kudos.
Thank you. I will send an email to the person who made the decision. So I appreciate that.
Well, so you may not be an expert in book jackets, Seth, but Bill is an expert in very unique questions, and he really has been asking that question repeatedly as he's looked at books. So I'm curious if there was a point in time with your traveling around the world with your expertise in fragile states, if there was kind of a specific moment when you thought, I think I need to write about the United States.
Well, I would say it wasn't traveling. I mean, I'm a person who, of course, follows my curiosity and follows. I listen to people. I try to put myself in the shoes of people. When I go to a country or even the United States, I want to go into homes. I want to go and hear what the people on the street are saying. I want to go places where people don't go. That's just my general inclination. But in terms of this particular book, it wasn't a question in my travels. It was that I lived in Washington. I still live outside of Washington. And 2015, 2016, we have the earthquake of American politics, which I think all of our listeners will know what is happening in those years. And so people in Washington, not just one person, but many people. And when it happens once or twice, I could brush it aside. But when it happens 6 or 7 times, I couldn't. They asked me over coffee, end of a meeting. Everybody knew me as the fragile states person. That was sort of my identity. They would ask me partly in jest, but then partly out of anxiety. Is America becoming a fragile state? And here I was. I had come back from Sri Lanka. I had come back from Nigeria, Middle East, and I'm thinking, well, we have a constitution that's over 200 years old. We have all these great institutions. Our government is pretty stable, whatever we think about its effectiveness, and we have such great technology. How can we compare the United States to these countries? Yet, I got this question many times, and I myself have always been aware that something about the relationships in America, it's not as warm, it's not as mutually supportive as I find in many places. So I took this question or series of questions as an invitation to explore, to seek out. And unlike most of those people, or maybe all of those people, when they were asking that question on the assumption that something was wrong with our politics, something was wrong with at the national level. And from my experience, when we talk about relationships and the health of any society, you have to look at it at many levels. If you ever speak to a sociologist, you'll hear about the micro, the meso, the macro. And so when we talk about what might be wrong in our society, well, first, my assumption is if something's wrong in politics, it's inevitably downstream from something wrong in society. And then the big question is, where do I look to find the answer in society? So my journey in the years after these questions, when I was looking to find an answer, was I was looking at all 3 of these levels, and I was going to lots of geographies, because one thing you learn over and over again is what is true in Washington will not be true in Eastern Kentucky, will not be true in Shreveport, Louisiana, will not be true in Detroit. And so you need to get around and understand the breadth of a country and how different people are experiencing it to have some idea of the answer.
And you're also touching on, I think, one of our interesting learnings at the Village Square. When we first started this, 17, 18 years ago, we just saw a problem in our hometown and we were thinking, there's not really any place for people who don't agree with each other to gather on important topics. And really, I think, what we were seeing back then is now what we're seeing in communities across the country is that lack of, social glue, civic fabric that's being undermined. And we actually have Bill, I don't know if you remember this, but years ago in one of our first strategic plans, we put a Mutt and Jeff cartoon in the strategic plan, and it was a gentleman on his hands and knees in a dark street corner with a street light above him, looking for something, and a police officer who happens upon them and says, what are you looking for? And he said, my keys. And he says, where'd you find it? 2 blocks over that way. Or where'd you lose it? 2 blocks over that way. And so the police and says, well, why are you looking for it here? And he says, the light is better. And the reason we put that in our strategic plan is kind of a reminder of the experience that we were having, which is looking at this national dysfunction that looks so big and horrendous, and realizing that if you look in communities where people live their lives, that's where we need to be looking for the solutions to a lot of these problems. And yet that's very counterintuitive, right? I mean, most people look at the national problem we're having and think national solutions.
I think there's, I'm quite with you, as you know, and I do believe we need to think about the country sideways, horizontally, and not vertically. And I do believe that our problems are only solvable place by place. And we could talk more about what that means. But I think there's a real problem in our national conversation is that partly because of the media, partly because of how national politics seems to dominate whatever's happening local, partly because of how our elite, how they see their careers. Their careers are from wherever they live. I will go to one of these big national universities, and then I'll go on and have a national career at a national company, a national government role, a national philanthropy, a national nonprofit. There's something about how we've organized the country that basically creates a brain drain from lots of places, makes the economy very uneven. It helps a relatively small part of the country, let's say up to 10 states versus the other 40. But even within cities, tends to help some parts of cities more than others. Maybe so some of this is inevitable because of technology. Some of this is inevitable because of globalization. But I think part of it goes to the fact that the people who do the thinking, whether they're in a policy role or whether they're in academia or they're playing some leading role in some organization that has a large influence, they are thinking about things only nationally. They're driving the debate only nationally. I think it's actually not only the national, they tend to think about things in material terms. They think about things in policy terms as if even people on the right, if I may go left and right, the left tends to be more material, the right tends to be more institutional. But then even if I look at most of the right of center thinkers and people, they're still talking about everything in terms of what the national government can do. So there's something about how I don't know if you want to call it our intellectual life, if that's what it is, or our cultural institutions or our ideas factories, something about them has been overly nationalized. And therefore, I think it actually misses what 75 or 80% of Americans experience. I do believe there's a small set of Americans that do live their life up here. But I think most Americans, they live their lives where they are. They are or could be quite satisfied where they are. And what we've done is we've created an economy, a society, a politics that's not working for them because it's not where they are. And the only way people will feel that they have a sense of agency, a sense of ownership, and actually give them more influence to make our society an economy and everything more democratic, you could argue, means that we have to bring things down to a human scale about where they are, what they can play a role in. And I think that's, if you look at American history, if I may just go on, I think the challenge we have is that if you go back and read de Tocqueville is what I would call America 1.0. That's the America in which everything was local, people lived in towns. Then you have industrialization, you have mass immigration, you have urbanization, and then there's an attempt to rebuild the social fabric, which is what you have in the late 19th century with all these trans-local organizations. That is America 2.0. Post-1960s, lots of change in where people live, how organizations are organized, and now you have this great dissatisfaction in large parts of America. We need to create a civil society or a set of social institutions that responds to America 3.0, and that is not going to happen in Washington. It's not going to happen top-down vertical. It's going to happen place by place, and ideally there's going to be lots of these networks. They're going to be helping people do more across the country. We need America 3.0 civil society.
So I want to give that a mic drop, and also maybe we could turn it into a rap riff. You think? because it is so essentially the thing we need to be doing together right now.
Yes. I volunteered to do it together. So let's find a way to do it together. We need to find a Liz in every town across the country, and then we'll all be set, right?
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
No, there are many of us in Tallahassee that would agree with that. I'm really glad to hear you invoke the name de Tocqueville, because I feel like his work, I see an awful lot of similarities between the kind of things that he was saying back in the 1830s and the things that you're saying now. But what's interesting to me, there are two things. One is that his work is called Democracy in America. So he's suggesting in his work that there are implications for our political life as a country in how much we invest in local communities. And there's something a little bit counterintuitive about that I think is really important for us today, and why I'm so thankful that you've written this book. But one of the things that I was fascinated to learn that I didn't know a lot about was kind of the post-Civil War era around the 1890s, turn of the century, where you describe a kind of, I think you called it the Great Quieting.
Quieting. It's a quote from somebody else. I cannot take credit for that great quote.
Well, it's a great concept. And I'd like for you to spend just a minute kind of unpacking some of that history and how the political rancor of the post-Civil War era ultimately led to some very fertile social engagement on the part of many people at a grassroots level.
A good question, Bill. So let me answer something that you said before I answer your question. So I'm going to give you two answers. So the thing about de Tocqueville, his book is Democracy in America, because his big question when he came to America was, how did the United States succeed where France failed? Mm-hmm. And he wrote another book, which is also a great book, which is less well known, in which he looks at basically France up to the revolution. And some of his insights there were also excellent. But the big contrast he was making was the U.S. as a society was hugely democratic, and it wasn't about the government. It was about the organizing power of society. Everywhere you went, there was an association for something. And you had this all over, I think more in the North than in the South, given the time period. But it was still this abundance of institutions that France did not have. And that abundance of institutions enabled Americans of all types, all classes, to participate in society in a democratic fashion, which I think, so then I go to your second question. So then we get to the America 2.0. The social economic landscape has been transformed by again, immigration and everything else I mentioned, urbanization, industrialization. You have the Civil War. The years after the Civil War were very bitter. Many of the arguments left over from the war continue to dominate American politics. And it was a very national, I mean, again, leading up to the war was very national. After the war was national. And then you had all these changes in society, and then something transforms. I believe it started in the 1880s, 1890s, early 20th century, is that there gets to a point where, one, a lot of local organizations are being built, but these are not the one-offs that de Tocqueville saw. They were national, but very chapter-based. So like the Veterans Association, we would still know. Something like the Grands, which is a rural-based, but existed. The Eastern Star, which I believe was very popular in the South. And some of these names we barely remember, but they had thousands and thousands of chapters. The largest had about 15,000 chapters across the country. And so we had the civil society was changing. And at the same time, people's energy were shifting from this national fight, again, more local. What could we do to make my neighborhood better, my city better, my state better? So the political energy shifted. There was a lot of effort to reform laws state by state, to weed out corruption state by state, to improve sanitation state by state. A lot of things that we take for granted today, they were being built and developed not in the 1930s. We tend to think of all this transformation in the 1930s. Actually, it's the progressive era, which is before the Great Depression, about a 40-year period from the 1880s to roughly the 1920s. So there was the great quieting happened nationally, not because the energy went out of politics or went out of society. It's because it shifted local, it shifted to practical, it shifted to what people could do. I mean, there was, of course, disputes, but it was more cooperative, it was more practical, it was more hands-on because it was local. And it had more impact because it really helped people place by place by place than these endless disputes nationally that had very, very hard to have a solution.
So I keep, sort of thinking about that shift. I keep thinking of The Upswing by Bob Putnam and Shailin Romney Garrett that describes that period of time. And one of their descriptors was that it was hard to tell. It was like a flock of birds moving, that everything seemed to move all at one time. There were just like so many things that became better with that shift that you're describing, but down to people's to community life, and that their sense was kind of that people just got tired of the difficulty, and they started to actually move, and so to me it's kind of interesting that we feel like we're such passive victims of this moment that we're in with the poisonous, toxic national politics, but in some ways we're the ones who are not moving and need to move, because that's what happened then, right? It happened inside communities between people who can know each other.
I mean, I would say, you can never go back, and history doesn't quite repeat itself. But the big change that happened was people stopped with fighting for the national elections. I mean, we have so much energy in our national elections, and I understand politics is important. I care who's elected, but I don't think it's very constructive. What would happen if even 10, 20% of that energy was shifted to making the places where people live better? And those are one of my big arguments is we will be much happier as people. We will be much more successful and thriving as a country when each of us looks at a human scale and say, what can I do to make a difference? What can I do to make a difference in my neighborhood? What can I do to make a difference in my city or my part of the city? Because some cities are much larger than others. Tallahassee, wonderful size. It's a size that anybody can actually say, I can make a difference, as opposed to 8 million people. You can feel a bit overwhelmed and lost. But there's a lot of medium-sized cities. There's a lot of towns, neighborhoods within larger cities. People can make a difference at that scale. And not only can they make a difference, they can have a tangible impact on a place they can see. They can have a tangible impact on a group of people, and they themselves can be enmeshed in relationships and institutions that will make themselves actually have a more fulfilling life than being angry on media or trying to do just protesting. I mean, I'm all for protests, but the point is the protests are not a daily thing. The real things that you could do day in and day out, week in, week out, that can make a huge difference in an identifiable group of people, including yourself. So it's a big question why we don't do more of that, especially when we hear more loneliness. I mean, partly it's the media drives us, but we all have a choice. We can stand up and say, I can do something here. And when I was in Tallahassee, I was very fortunate that you introduced me to someone in your government who works on neighborhoods. And I got to meet all these people who their main passion is making their neighborhoods better. And they had to roll up their sleeves and work in the garden or what have you sometimes. But they had a passion and they had a real sense of fulfillment for what they do in a way that I find people in politics often don't.
So in many ways, the thing that we need to do to strengthen our neighborhoods is also the thing we need to do to heal ourselves, to feel like we belong, that we're not lonely, and that we're in a community of people who see us and care about us.
Yeah. So go ahead. I can answer that, or you go ahead, Bill.
One of the most provocative things about your book, in my mind, is that you come at a lot of social problems that we have heretofore sought to tackle kind of in programmatic silos: housing, education, family breakdown, whatever it might be, and you and deal with these often with policy instruments that are narrowly focused. And you argue, correct me if I'm wrong, that sometimes it's wiser to take a place-based strategy of trying to deal with problems rather than to only isolate on this over here and on that over there, because often these problems are all interconnected, and that if we can transform places, we will help to lift individuals and households within those places much more successfully than if we only target the individual or the household. Help unpack that a little bit, and how that happens in some of the case studies that you have identified in your book.
So you put your finger right on it. I do believe where we live has enormous impact on our well-being. I mean, just look at the average lifespan in the United States. There's a 40-year gap between the best and worst neighborhoods. More typically, there would be a 20-year gap. So you could live in the same city, or you could live in two counties outside of a city, and there could be a 20-year gap in the lifespan. And so that says there's a lot of things going on that's not about the individual, that's about the place. In general, of course, if somebody needs a house or somebody needs food, I consider that a humanitarian. But we also have to think about development. Development is very place-based. Humanitarian, so there is a need for that. But what I find, most of our social services, our philanthropy, so much is based on these silos of just delivering services. And again, some of that is needed, but it's not transformational. In some ways, it's enormously constraining because, first of all, it divides people into one, and people's strength as individuals, as persons, is actually their connections, their ability to come together, their ability to have social capital, their ability to have relationships, their ability to be part of institutions and the strength of institutions. And none of that is taken into account when we just deliver services one by one. So for me, a place-based approach is about changing the fundamental conditions in which people live. And again, that makes sense if it's a lot of poor people in one neighborhood, but to me, it also makes sense on a certain level, even if it's a materially well-off neighborhood. Imagine a neighborhood in which nobody knows each other, and then imagine that neighborhood was more based on a community school, or that where people worshiped were locally, or imagine if government had a level that was only accountable to that neighborhood, and it wasn't based on silo. Or imagine if that neighborhood had a center. Imagine if the neighborhood had a few meeting places in the center. Imagine if there were some associations just for that neighborhood. Imagine again, this thing goes back to institutions matter, abundance of institutions. And the more we belong, we're able to take part in, the more we contribute, the more that's of our daily organic life, I think the happier we will be, the more a place will thrive. That is not possible in a siloed approach. And I would say when we talk most about services, we're talking poor neighborhoods. And actually the data for the last many decades is the worst neighborhoods of concentrated poverty, they only have been going up and up, partly because when you give siloed approach, the people who can take best advantage, they will leave, and the neighborhood will lose their best leaders, their best talent, their best people, instead of thinking that what they need is to attract people, attract places to like coffee shops and restaurants and businesses. If we turn this strategy around and focus on making each neighborhood a success, you would be drawing people in. The services actually forces the better people to leave. So it's a completely different mindset about how to think about society. It's also a completely different mindset about making the worst places better.
It's interesting. This reminds me of the book, The Weirdest People in the World, Joseph Henrich. And so weird stands for Western educated, industrial, rich democracies. And those of us who grow up in them and learn in them, and then also, so many of sort of the academic elite are in big cities that you referenced, all over the
country. The weird of the, I would call them the weird of the weird.
Yeah. And so they're thinking, so you're describing a sort of a weird way of viewing the world, right? It's analytical, it's kind of instrumental, it's in ones and zeros, and it's not taking into account the web of interconnectivity, the little platoons that exist inside of communities, that when you tap them, it changes everything. So, I mean, we've seen that over the years, is that sort of mindset that is analyzing rather than looking holistically at the problem.
Yes. I mean, you could even argue our politics is very binary, partly because of this thinking. I mean, whenever I look at these problems that we have or these disputes, I'm often astonished why we don't look at things across a continuum. And when I for whatever reason, I went to very good schools. I grew up in the United States, but I spent a lot of time outside the country. And so maybe that's part of it. But I find that we don't think well, we don't think very correctly, or we don't think very well. We don't actually look for solutions. And we're not very creative because of this, because something to do with this weird brain. The weird brain has benefits. I mean, our country is dynamic, our country is efficient, our country is relatively wealthy. And I think that goes something to the nature of the advantages that a weird world will bring. But I think it constrains our thinking about many problems. And in the way I look at society, social flourishing means being embedded in strong institutions and being connected. And I know some people will say Americans just want freedom, but there's no clash. This, again, is one of these false dichotomies that freedom and choice means being against relationships and place and embedded institutions. And so I don't see those as a false, as actually being opposed to each other. In fact, the world that de Tocqueville describes was a world of enormous, rich associational and social life, and yet enormous freedoms and enormous economic opportunity. And the two reinforce each other. And I think people like de Tocqueville, when they think about the thriving national state of a country like the United States, they clearly believe that it's based upon something in terms of local thriving. And I do believe the weird brain, partly because of the types of jobs people have, partly because of how we frame problems in our society, is really limited to understanding some of the issues we're talking about. I found this over and over again. In fact, you may not know, but I have a book on culture and human rights, and I basically put a society of thick relationships versus a society of thin relationships. And the whole idea of the thin relationships is the weird. It comes right out of the weird. That whole there's a field of cultural psychology where that thinking comes out of. And I basically contrast how these two societies view thriving, and then what are the implications for policy and human rights and other issues based upon the way you frame the world. And for me, the weird mind frames the world in a very limited way.
So, Seth, you may not know, but Bill probably suspects that I think that any conversation on important issues is the quality of it is directly proportional to how many times you mention Alexis de Tocqueville in it. So thank you.
Well, I also liked your reference to weird, although in a completely different context. I'm a big fan of the idea of keep Austin weird, and feel like part of the idea that I really love about your book is you're saying, hey, there is the potential for local communities to find common identity in a way that is possible at a local level, but much harder at a national level. So you've encouraged us to think locally, in part because we can bridge there much more easily. We all have.
Yes.
We have an interest in making our community better. Yes, at a certain level, we all want to make America better, but how much any one of us as a human being can really do that, like you said earlier, much harder than at a local level. But what I want to ask you to comment on is the whole idea of bonding and not simply bridging. Putnam talks a lot in his book about the difference between bridging capital and bonding capital. And we have, even in our local community, even in ideal places like Tallahassee, we have differences over religion, over politics, over race, over other things. And I'm curious to know kind of the role that you would say local institutions that have as their primary focus bonding, and I'm thinking perhaps especially here of ethnic communities or religious communities, what role they can actually play in helping to push back against fragility and to help both offer the benefits of place-based strategies to individual citizens and the spillover effects that might have for their neighbors who are outside their bonding community.
That's a really good question. And so I think it's clearly easier to build bonding when you have some common identity bringing you together. You can think of Irish and Italian and other immigrants several decades ago. You can think of today, you have some immigrant groups, whether it's Chinese or Somali or other groups like that, in which they are recent arrivals in the United States and their ethnic bonding is still strong. I think after 2 or 3 generations, they will typically lose that. I mean, you see with religion, you see it in my case with my religion and my faith community, you see it among the Amish. I think among the Christian denominations, the strongest might be the Church of Latter-day Saints, because they have very communal institutions, and they have social practices that bring people together. It historically was the case with Catholics. I think Catholics have not emphasized the parish system as much as they might have, and they could have. And one of my arguments to Christians is they should step in to their place-based community in the way that most of them are not right now. I think historically Christians were enormously place-based, communally oriented, and it's been lost in recent decades. And I think they certainly could be a force for bringing people together. So I believe that on one level, ethnic and religion can play that role. I think my whole idea of neighborhoods and with an identity and a shape and a way of bringing people together physically and institutionally is on some level my attempt to replicate some of what those ethnic or religious groups can do for a more diverse neighborhoods, because I think you won't get the same level of bonding, but you can get much more level of bonding than we currently have. So it's a recognition that what you're describing is not replicable across many parts of America. I would guess very back of the envelope that say 20 or 25% of American neighborhoods have a certain level of social flourishing. I've seen it religiously. I've seen it because of the nature of the institutions. I've seen it culturally, maybe more in towns than in some towns. You can go to some parts of America, to smaller place. And I've seen it because you're physically cut off. Even if you're in a bigger city, if you're somehow your neighborhood is physically designed a certain way, I do think it helps. So I've seen 4 types that I believe work. And so I think we should be doing that. In terms of you're also hinting on at the fact is, if it bonds ethnically, religiously, what are the implications for other people in the place? And this is where we talk about the community versus the individual. I think, of course, there's always a balance. A group can bond so much that it excludes, and a group can bond so weakly that it doesn't matter. So the point is, what's the medium? I have seen in places with a lot of healthy bonding that people who are, even if they're not in that community, I can think of my neighborhood and how people reach out to non-Jewish neighbors. I don't think it will be everybody. It's hard to generalize, but I can just think on my street, we have a Black family who plays with the people who are not Black and they go to a church, we go to a synagogue, and they play quite regularly together. They play basketball, they play some sort of whatever other sports, and that's normal. And I don't think it would be the case if people in my faith community were not so place-based, so much on the street, so much a norm that you talk with your neighbors. So I think if the bonding is done correctly, it creates norms that extend to other people in the same place. Other hand, I can easily imagine it not doing that. So there's a tension there. And the answer is not to have zero, but the answer also is not to be exclusionary. And you have to find the right balance, I do believe.
This is really, really good. I want the record to show, Liz, that our Orthodox Jewish friend has advocated for Christian localists, maybe not Christian nationalists, but Christian localists.
I mean, you should see again, and I know we didn't get to, since you're going to edit some of this, I didn't get to any of the stories in the book, so I should give some stories. But to be honest, I published in First Things, making this argument. I think you know what First Things is. And Christianity Today has just accepted a piece that will likely come out in May. They have to see the full piece. They accepted my pitch. I was on the Russell Morso, and I think there's no place with more institutions all across the country than the churches, to be very honest.
Yeah, and let me just say here that one of the things that some people just entering into this conversation may find strange, and maybe the problem is on our part for using the term, but when you speak of institutions, you're not advocating for institutional in the sense that a lot of times, like when we think of medicine, and you're very much advocating, as I hear it, for a very human-based,
human scale, local social institutions. In fact, the most important institutions are not registered with the government. They're not actually, I mean, there are organizations that matter, but simply the interfamily networks.
Yes.
An extremely important type of institution. It's not very formal. It could be WhatsApp groups. It could be carpool groups. It could be volunteering. Different people show up different times. That, if you have it in the neighborhood versus if you don't, what a difference that makes every day in your life. It's incredible. And it's not a fixed thing, but it's like institutions can be norms. It can also be the abundance of local organizations that actually matter. And so I don't think people realize how much of a desert or how much of a void we've created by emptying out this part of our lives in the last 2 generations.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. But yeah, when you're talking about institutions, it's not sterile. It's the Boy Scouts, the Rotary Club, the Little League,
And yes, that
all of these things that
all
often
of
give us
that, as
warm
well as
fuzzies.
those that you cannot see,
Yeah,
as well as remember when we talk about institutions, we have the visible and the invisible, and the invisible. I mean, the invisible actually shape the visible.
yes.
It's hard to explain those that you can actually list out how thriving they are depends upon what's going on around them. And I just see it in my own life. All these little things people do for each other, I'm astounded by it because I know what life is like without any of it. And then those bunch of institutions we have, there's so much rushing towards them because of all these things people are already doing it. I mean, and does one create the other, or which is what? I think the invisible plays an enormous role in affecting the visible, actually. And I think people get it wrong when they think backwards.
So you write in Fragile Neighborhoods about your neighborhood. Talk some about how your neighborhood is different than many of ours.
Well, on one level, there's obviously the connection that mine is a place-based community because of the religion. But if I can think of neighborhoods that are thriving that do not have that ingredient. And I think what they have in common is the nature of what the relationships between people. And so I could just think of, I can throw out some examples. Let me throw out some examples. I can think of the easy example that my wife occasionally has to rush to New York, several hours away driving or by train or something, because her mother is not doing well. And that sometimes that happens on short notice. And sometimes I need help with the carpool because we do have a community school, but the community school is not walking distance from us. And so she goes away, whatever it was, a couple months ago. And I need 4 people to help with 4 rides. And I need someone to watch my kids after school because I'm not home. And there's not an app that will fix this problem for me. And maybe some people have an app for that. I've never found that app, haven't looked for it. But I had 4 different families on 2 days, mornings, afternoons, playing that role. I can think of the time many years ago, maybe 4 years ago or something by now, 4 or 5 years ago, my daughter, we came out of our car and my oldest daughter was carrying her younger brother, who was probably about a year or something at that point, and dropped him on the cement in front of my house because she was carrying him. It was too heavy, and it with a bloody chin. And you're like a panicking parent. You can imagine the anguish. And my wife doesn't wait for me. She picks him up and just runs down the street and doesn't even tell me where she's going. And we're left, what's going on? Comes back, whatever, 30 minutes, 40 minutes later. Yes, he will go to urgent care later in the day, but he comes back bandaged, initial diagnosis, because we have nurses. We know where the nurses are. And I could just go on and on. When you walk down the streets and you know who's behind the doors, you have a sense of comfort. When you're greeting people in your neighborhood, it gives you a certain feeling. When we have couple of restaurants. I go into the restaurant. I know the owner. I know several of the families that are sitting there already, even if I don't know them well. It's about relationships. You don't need lots of friends, but I have hundreds of relationships, people who would expect me to do something, or I would be doing something for them, or they would be doing something for me. And it may not be we're friends, but we have a simple level of expectation that we're available for each other. We're going to give to each other. We're going to help each other. We're going to be friendly with each other. We're going to support each other. It just changes your whole worldview. It makes you feel a sense of security. It makes you feel joyful. I see a lot of Americans alone, unsupported, alienated, disconnected, and just they take their anger out on politics, to be honest, because they don't know what else to do. I think if they were experiencing life differently, they would be looking for answers in a different place, and they would not have this anger.
What a beautiful picture of what it is we're missing. What a beautiful picture. And actually, if I can follow up briefly on that, because you mentioned this as well. So we're not connecting with each other in communities, in how we live our daily lives. and then we get focused on politics. I have heard both of you say individually, this has been something that Bill has talked about for many years, and then you wrote about in the book that you think that we spend too much of our time and energy on politics. We've made it too big a part of our lives.
Yeah. So if you come to my house, there's no signs on my front yard. There's no signs on the car. I avoid it. We have some signs inside of our house, but nothing is political. It's actually about whatever, something that, I don't know, Thomas Jefferson said, or something that, some of those Benjamin Franklin's 10, whatever. We have those we actually have that in our kitchen. I think it's Thomas Jefferson in my kitchen. And so I love those old books and what they're telling us, but it would be hard for you to find a sign of politics in our life. And I know some of my neighbors, they are a little more passionate about politics than I, but for the most part, I don't have the foggiest idea what my neighbors' political opinions are. I mean, those that I know intimately, and there's a few of those, I have some idea what their politics are. Let's be honest, it comes up after you're with them for 3 hours for lunch. It will come up at some point. But for the most part, when I'm saying hi to people, when I'm talking to people, I was at some dinner in my community last night. Nobody talks politics. People talk about kids. People talk about schools. People talk about, I don't know, the economy, jobs, all these types of daily things that you have in your life. People do not talk politics. It's incredibly absent in my daily life. And every time I hear people talk about it, I was talking to a former student actually last week. She had been out of the country for 6 years in Singapore. She came back. And one of the things that she actually read my book, and of the whole book, the thing that she had to put a finger on when we met for coffee was this idea about neighbors not talking politics. So she had come back and found out how odd it was that everyone she would meet in her neighborhood with her, she has, I think, a 2.5-year-old, even the kids in the play, whatever, the nursery school, wherever the kid is, something about people looking at each other and immediately reflecting on their politics. And I was like, I've sort of heard people saying this, but I couldn't imagine it because I don't experience that world at all. In fact, I feel I'm in a different America because of my surroundings, because all of these things I hear from other people, they don't relate, because for the most part, they don't touch my life at all. And it would be scary for me to have to go to a nursery school and think about politics. I mean, come on, or talk to my neighbor and think about politics. I mean, it seems like people are they need to find something to divide each other up. So this is what they're looking at now. It'd be much better if we divided up us. And not that I'm against other countries, but think of us as unity and something to help our country, and just worry how we are versus other places in the world, and not worry about how we are versus each other. I think we've had a little bit too comfortable. I work on peace. So for me, where I go to countries, the most existential question is, when will we stop the fighting? That's always the first question. Or what will we ever get to the fighting? So I think if we were to recognize how lucky we are to not have those types of questions, can we make our lives more constructive in terms of where we are? I mean, there's so many ways to do so, and politics is not the answer.
So I really appreciate that, like so many other things in your book. In fact, part of the reason why I love your book so much is because it helps for me to explain to other people not just why I live in what I think is the best city in America, but why I also live in the best neighborhood in the best city in America. And so
is Liz in the same neighborhood?
Well, no.
Let me describe why I think my neighborhood is so great, because I want you, in closing here, this will be my last question. It's really a two-part question, is to give advice to local policymakers about how they can improve local communities, as well as individual people, what they can do. And let me just say, in my case, part of the reason why our neighborhood is so great is that there is a park that is a third place where people regularly gather, where they walk their dogs, where they, play basketball, and where it's a gathering spot. And because our neighborhood is a very pedestrian-friendly community, you're constantly running into people on the street who are headed to the park or go back from the park or whatever it might be. So I want you to talk about especially kind of what local policymakers can do to help create third places like that gather people. But then the other thing that I think distinguishes our neighborhood and our city is, and this predates me, and I don't know how this tradition got started, but somewhere along the lines, the people on Beard Street, which is the street I live on, decided that come every year when Halloween rolls around, we're just going to decorate all the houses for that and really go all out. And now we have people from all over the city that will come to Beard Street and, trick or treat in our area. Not my favorite holiday, not the tradition I would have chosen, but we participate happily because it's such a unifying event for us and our neighbors. And so I want you to talk not just about what policymakers can do to help facilitate third places and better community interaction, but also what individual citizens, what neighbors can do to join together to create sometimes goofy traditions like our Halloween celebration that help to bring people together and give them a reason to appreciate one another.
Okay, so what you've pointed out is that the physical design of a neighborhood can have enormous impact on social relationships. And so my argument is the physical and the institutional. So it's, again, if you have small businesses, places to gather, that's part of it, because there's an institution behind that. But it's also, think about every institution that we interact with, from government to philanthropy to houses of worship to schools to, I just put something up on LinkedIn last week about what would it mean if libraries actually were neighborhood, much smaller, thought of themselves not only as places for knowledge or accessing knowledge, but also places where people would gather at a human scale. So I see a lot of libraries, for example, creating like sports and other facilities. So they're becoming a little bit more a community center, except that the scale is so large that it's not incubating relationships. Imagine libraries and all these other institutions. So if I'm a policymaker, we're in a world where there's, for most people, again, there are people who really need the library. We are big users of libraries here. We're going all the time to the library, taking books, partly because we don't give our kids phones and we don't have a TV. The library becomes very important for us, as well as buying books. But I think, imagine that all these institutions, and I as a policymaker was seeing that we're in a world not with a shortage of knowledge, but now a shortage of relationships. We're relationship deficient more than we are knowledge deficient. And therefore, libraries and other institutions, if talking about policymakers, so let's talk about public institutions. How could public institutions be rethought for an age of relationship deficiency? This is a big question. So I think the physical landscape, that would mean, again, not only a park, but there needs to be places where people can meet, coffee shops, restaurants. It should be local. But again, associations that cover hundreds of thousands of people are not the same as associations that cover 10,000 people. Libraries that cover hundreds of thousands of people are not the same as a library that would cover 10 or 20, whatever, some small scale. I don't expect that would be an easy transformation because of all the legacy assets. But imagine that government was not about just the vertical and delivering services, but partly, Tallahassee has a neighborhood team. And that is innovative because a lot of cities don't have a neighborhood team. But what I found out from talking to a neighborhood team is that they see their main purpose is improving the delivery of services. Imagine that instead, the neighborhood was designed so it wasn't the silos, how many housing, how many this, how many that. Imagine it was looking at the city, dividing it up into neighborhoods or a couple of neighborhoods in one unit, and it was reorganized so those silos reported The neighborhood team you have is more on the periphery, trying to leverage things. What would happen if the whole government was around every neighborhood? It was structured in such a way, and its focus was on ensuring the thriving of each of these places. So I'm thinking about all that. In terms of the second question is, the more each neighborhood has a very unique identity, unique meeting places, unique even architecture. If you go around like an Italian city, or, I mean, Tallahassee is not that far from a place like New Orleans, or another direction, Savannah. These are cities that were built pre-cars, and each of them have unique neighborhoods with unique design. I don't know New Orleans as much as I know Savannah, because I was in Savannah last year, but they have parks and they have shops around, and everything about the physical landscape is very human scale, neighborhood level. So imagine you did that, and then about activities, ideally the identity, the architecture, the physical itself is different enough, and it's bonding enough so that they're organically going to have their own identity and their uniqueness. But we certainly could think about everything from block parties or block events. You talked about Halloween. I've known neighborhoods that have been around Christmas with lots of things going on. I can imagine neighborhoods around Thanksgiving being less about we being in the house and more about something about original Thanksgiving was actually a bridging between two groups of people. I can imagine like holidays. I can imagine different seasons. And so if I'm a government and I actually think about neighborhoods, and I've created a landscape which each neighborhood has some sort of unique identity, unique physical design elements so that there are more bonding, unique set of institutions. I mean, I don't think it's a top-down thing, just like your Halloween was not a top-down thing, but the idea that each of these places has something different to celebrate about their uniqueness. It could even be a local bar. It could, it could be not that every neighbor wants to have a bar on their street, but it could be the local bar. It could be some local, I don't know, high school team. It could be many, many things. And then the question is, the government would be to nurture and support that. I think it's hard to impose that from the government side, but the idea that each neighborhood embraces something special about the calendar year and they do something. I mean, we were in neighborhoods in Tallahassee, really big on the neighborhood gardens. So could they be doing events around the gardens? Maybe they already are. But the whole thing is to celebrate it, make that place feel special, and invite some people from the neighborhood and beyond the neighborhood. I mean, there's countless number of ideas to do that.
So, Bill, if I see a banner coming into your neighborhood that says, keep Lafayette Park weird, I'm going to know exactly where that came from. Seth Kaplan, conversation. So
there you go.
So I want to thank Bill for hanging out with us. And then before I thank you officially, Seth, I wanted to ask my last question, which is one of the most, your book is filled with really important ideas. One of the ones that really caught my heart was the idea that you mentioned earlier in the conversation, which is going sideways. If you can say a word about what sideways means.
Okay. So when I think about society sideways, and I often find it very odd that people think, especially in a country of the scale, one of the things that's most astonishing about the United States, if you come from overseas, and I have my foreign eyes to some extent, been after living overseas and working overseas for so many years, is the scale of this country. And yet we often debate things as if there's an answer that will mean the same thing in Alabama as it's going to mean in New Hampshire, as it's going to mean in Oregon. And those are states. And even within a state, I was in Texas a few weeks ago, and what a huge state. I don't think anything that goes in the East goes in the West. What a big state. It's like a country in itself, more than one country. So when I think sideways, I'm thinking sideways actually on two levels. I'm thinking sideways is the nature of relationships locally, and the fact that instead of thinking that there's a silo, there's a material siloed approach, I'm thinking the stronger our social bonds together in a sideways, we are working together. We have horizontal relationships. The stronger that is, you can think again about the bonding social capital we talked about before. I think the more likely our neighborhood will thrive. I also think sideways means a couple of other things. One is the relationships between those neighborhoods. That's where the bridging matters. A neighborhood can thrive to a certain extent based on its social bonds, but if that neighborhood is disconnected, doesn't have ties. I mean, I went to Tallahassee to a few neighborhoods in which they were actually trying to improve the connectiveness of those neighborhoods because they historically had not been very well connected with the rest of the city, and therefore they were disadvantaged. So it also going to be sideways across. And then on a larger national scale, I believe, again, we need to look for solutions, not in Washington, not at some national level, not for some magic bullet. We need to look at it place by place by place, because each of these places will have different leaders, different organizations, different strategies. There are some common themes, but ultimately, making relationships better, making a place better, needs to be done within the place. And this country has an awful lot of places.
And then we don't have to wait on Washington to fix it if we go sideways, because they're not going to.
No, I'm not waiting for Jimmy Stewart to go to Washington, if you know the movie, and to win his legislative battle. I don't think most things that can be done, that need to be done to improve our places, will depend upon politics, actually. It might depend on local politics. It might depend upon things we can do together. There are obviously some things the government could do that would be helpful, but I think it's a really small minority that we need to make our lives better.
Dr. Seth Kaplan, thank you so much for joining us today. And everyone, if you haven't read Fragile Neighborhoods, Repairing American Society One Zip Code at a Time, it's one of the most important and empowering things you can read right now. Thank you, Seth.
Thank you. I'm honored to be with you again, Liz and Bill. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh man, that was fun. That was thought provoking. This is Corey. Hi, I'm back here, Corey Nathan. This one got me thinking in terms of what I can do to plug into my community. And my first choice, obviously, is to have a Liz Joyner in my town. Like they were saying, a Liz Joyner in every town. But we all love Liz, you know that. But it's interesting that Dr. Kaplan mentioned New Orleans, because one of my best friends lives down in New Orleans. He's been down there since the early to mid 90s. And it always struck me as technically a big city, but in a lot of ways a small town. That's how I always experienced that New Orleans. And it's why it's one of, if not my favorite city in the world, or one of the many reasons. So we were going to this sporting event, my best friend who's been down there, and there was a small gathering, and within our little huddle, if you will, within our little group, the mayor at that time, the mayor of New Orleans, was among us. Not too far over, just like the next little group over, John Goodman, the famous actor, was hanging out too. But then in our group too, I wish I remembered what this dude's name was. But it was like what I thought was a generic term, but it was actually his name. So it was either neighbor or it was friend. And I asked my buddy about it. I'm like, no. He said, no. His name's friend, or his name's neighbor. You know, it was one of those words, and I wish I remembered it. If I ever write the story down, I'll go back to Mark and I'll ask him. But neighbor, let's call him neighbor for these purposes. Neighbor happened to be a homeless dude. He didn't have a house. You know, he was, but he was somebody that the neighborhood embraced, the neighborhood sort of adopted, you know, the mayor was, you know, it was clear that they knew each other. They liked each other. They saw each other. They were comfortable with each other, you know, so you get the mayor, like the dude who's in charge of the whole city. And you get this dude who, you know, a lot of folks like, let's face it, we kind of walk past folks that are in a situation like that. Oftentimes we look the other way. We don't want to engage. But not only was the very mayor of the town hanging out, but he was hanging out with somebody they each considered each other a friend. It was cool. It was cool that there were tight bonds there, that transcended economic status or life situations. So it really struck me that's why I come back to thinking New Orleans is technically a big city, but in a lot of ways it's a small town. So I started also thinking about, as I was listening to this program today, what ways can I be more mindful about that in my town? And I came up with 3 general areas where I can start to develop those bonds and relationships. And, it's not like, it's not activism, if you will. It's not political necessarily, but in some ways it is political. And the 3 ways I came up with was find restaurants or coffee shops or bars to go to on a regular enough basis where people get to know your name, like the Cheers, where everybody knows your name. What I found is that if I go to a place more than once within the span of a month, somebody, whether it's behind the counter or other folks who go there, will take notice. Like, you kind of give that nod if it's just once or twice a month. If you hit a 3rd time within the span of a month, even if it's going for a cup of coffee, or even if it's going to a restaurant and you're just getting a soda, and hanging out and catching up on your reading. But if you go there about 3 times in a month, they do start to maybe not know your name, but make you feel like you belong there, like you're an extension of your home. And then you do that on a regular basis over a period of time, and then you develop this kind of shorthand with some of the people. There's this there's this one place I go to on a somewhat regular basis. And listen, I'm not rich, so it's not like I'm throwing around, $100 lunches every single day. Sometimes I'm just getting a snack or something. But there's this one place I go to in town, and I go there enough. And the guy who runs it, he every time I'm leaving, he goes, "See you tomorrow." And I don't go there every day, but we just have this shorthand together, because if I don't go there the next day, he notices, which is kind of cool, so that's one way. And I have a relationship with the dude who owns this restaurant and runs this restaurant. He's always behind the counter there. Another way that I found is I started going for walks and during pandemic, really long walks. And I've run into people around my neighborhood, and part of my walk is through, the blocks where the streets are going. I'm lucky because I'm close enough to these horse trails where it just becomes a lot more open, but still I get to know the people there. I see this guy, Norman, who's working out on his property with his horses. Across from Norman are Danielle and Jennifer. They're still kind of new to the area, but I stopped one day. I talked to them about, they were thinking about where to send their kids to school. So I had some insights about all the different options, charter schools or home. Some of our friends homeschooled. So we had a conversation about that. I got to know Dwayne and his wife, Kathy. They had been there for a long time, and over time bought up these, lots in this open area, and he's a dude that just, he was working for, he had a what do you call it? A studio job. So he was a union guy, and just interesting getting to know. I just met a guy named Pat from Pittsburgh the other day. That's how I remembered his name, Pat from Pittsburgh. You get to just this morning I saw Pierino. His name is Pete, but I call him Pierino because he's from Italy originally. So you get to know people, and those bonds are formed by seeing folks and being mindful about saying, hey, some folks just like to, wave, or there's a couple people who don't even look up, and that's fine too. That's, you do you. But some folks I've developed a nice relationship with. There's one other way that I started doing this year, and that is by going to getting involved in charities around town. There's 4 major ones. And I decided that, if we have the extra funds that, we're going to give to these local charities. The one that's coming up here in about a month is the Boys and Girls Club. And what's interesting about that is I started seeing the same people giving their time, in some cases, to those local charities. And in other cases, folks who are doing pretty well financially, they're giving their financial resources. So that's cool too. But I end up seeing these same people. And again, it reminded me of that experience from when I was down in New Orleans, where I see 2 or 3 of the folks that are on the city council, and now I've become friends with them. One guy in particular who he was a New York Giants fan. He's older than me, so he was still in New York. He grew up there, and he's old enough to have remembered the New York Giants before they moved to San Francisco. So and he's on the city council now. His name's Bill. So I tease him because he was mayor pro tem for a term. So I still call him Mayor Bill because it's a term of affection, but there's also other folks who are in different situations that aren't in government or leadership positions, but sometimes they're part of the charitable work, and folks from all different all different walks of life. But I'm getting to know people, human beings in my neighborhood, and it makes me feel a part of this place and connected with the people of this place. And it just, I think that where a lot of us feel helpless at times with what's going on in national politics, and that our endeavors might seem futile, we can make an impact on people's lives that live right next door to us, quite literally. And that might not seem as sexy as like running for president and getting elected and being the most powerful person in the world. But in a way, I was just thinking of this today. There's this great mid-century theologian, Heschel, who said there's a sanctity in the mundane. And I really believe that, whether you're religious or Jewish or Christian or atheist or not, there is a profundity in that thought, that my conversation of hanging out with Pierino for 30 seconds on our walks when we're passing each other, and I pet his dog, Bella, there's a sanctity in the mundane. And in that way, we're not covering miles and miles of terrain, of activist terrain, of political terrain, but in some ways we are, even in that inch, even in those feet. So that's how we can make our fragile neighborhoods more sturdy, I think. Anyway, I went off on a little tangent here today, but this conversation got me thinking of how can I apply what I've been listening to. These are just a few of the ways. Remember the New Orleans story? Go to a few restaurants or coffee shops or a bar more than once or twice a month, and people start to get to know your name. Go for a walk, and listen, I lived in cities at different points in my life, as well as in the deep South at different points in my life. So, you got to know where to walk, where not to walk as well sometimes. But if you go for a walk, you'll start to get to know your neighbors that way. The other folks who live in your neighborhood. And charity events. Get involved in a charity. Give your time if you have some time. Give some money if you have some money. Chamber of Commerce events and other places where people gather together to be a part of that neighborhood. Those are the different ways that I thought of as I was listening to this conversation. And with that, it is time to close out today. Please consider joining our members and supporting this programming. You can become a member for just $7 a month or $76 a year, and your business can join for $250. Go to villagesquare.us/donate to join today. And while you're there, sign up for Village Square's newsletter to stay up to date with everything happening at the Village Square. Go to villagesquare.us and scroll to the bottom for the sign-up box. You'll get that newsletter. They won't bombard you. It's all good stuff. And they have so many great programs, digital programs, in-person programs, the podcast. You want to listen to the podcast. Funding for this podcast was provided through a grant from Florida Humanities with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Florida Humanities or National Endowment for the Humanities. We appreciate you listening to Fragile Neighborhoods, repairing American society one zip code at a time. Until next time, we challenge you to reach out with an open heart and mind to someone who doesn't look or think like you. It changes everything. We'll talk to you soon, and thanks so much for listening to Village Squarecast.